This is a webinar put on by the College of Operational Excellence. For those of you who may not be familiar with the Production Operations Management Society, that's POMS, we have a number of different colleges. We call them colleges. They're really special interest groups around different topics. And this one is in the area of operational excellence, and lean is in particular one of the important paradigms or areas or concepts that we talk a lot about in our college. Recently, there was a set of commentaries published in the Journal of Operations Management. That was earlier this year. Some of you probably saw that. Some really great dialogue by some of the top researchers in the area of lean. And that sparked this idea, or this thought of going a little bit further and giving some of these commentators a chance to interact with each other in a live sense. And that's where the idea for the webinar kind of got started. So the focus of the webinar today is really about research and next steps in research, what we can do as academics to further our understanding of the phenomenon of lean, the concepts of lean, but it also has a very practice-oriented, hopefully we'll have a very practice-oriented perspective as well. And we have, of course, two of the luminaries in the field who I'll introduce in just a minute to help us kind of stay grounded and have a real world perspective on it, as well as we have some top academics as well. We want to make this as interactive as possible. There is this delay going on between what we're saying and what happens on YouTube, but we have two ways for you in the audience to interact with us. First of all, we're going to have a poll, a short poll that goes on in the background, and we're going to ask you to answer 3 questions. And then at some point in the seminar or the webinar, we'll bring up the results of those poll and respond to that. And then the other way that you can interact is through the YouTube chat. If you'll just post questions or comments even in the YouTube chat at several points throughout the session, we'll bring up those questions. And at the end, we'll try to preserve some time to try to address as many of those questions as we can get to. So we look forward to your interaction, participation in that way. Before we get going, we want to say thank you to our sponsors. Sponsors help us in many different ways, and not the least of which is monetary sponsorship, of course, in helping us putting on events like this. We're going to put on a mini conference at the POMS conference, and I'll talk a little bit more about later, that the sponsors are helping us with very much. So we very much appreciate their support. Also want to identify the team. So this is the leadership team for the Operational Excellence College. I have the pleasure of serving as the president right now. And then the top 4 folks here, Gopesh Anand, Vijay Gargaya, and Torbjörn Netland and Matthias Tur are on the committee at this point, and you can see their different roles represented there. And also we have an advisory committee, several of which are on the webinar today. And these folks are, as you probably know, very well-known researchers and practitioners in the world of operational excellence, and they've helped us a lot with programming, with thinking about who we should be trying to speak to and what we should try to be saying and what kinds of events we should have. So without further ado, let me introduce the panelists and we'll start to get into our discussion. Again, I think most of you probably know these folks, so I'm going to keep my introductions very brief. But first of all, Tyson Browning, I have the pleasure of having Tyson as a colleague here at Texas Christian University. Many of you probably know that Tyson is the current co-editor-in-chief at Journal of Operations Management. And Tyson has some really interesting perspectives on lean, and he has published a number of different papers, particularly in the area of lean in the context of product development and the production of innovative products. So he's going to be offering some thoughts from those perspectives today. I mentioned Torbjörn a minute ago. He's on our committee, of course. Torbjörn, I would call him a rising star. He's an assistant professor at ETH, also known as the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich. And he's already published several really thought-provoking papers, mainly addressing implementation of lean and the particular roles of leadership. And he also brings some more, I would say, recent and unique perspectives in how we should study lean. Rachna Shah, again, many of you probably know Rachna. She's been one of the most impactful researchers in the area of lean. I think that her paper on lean bundles with Peter Ward is probably the most cited. I think it's the most cited research paper that is, that addresses lean topics. So we're really happy to have her with us. And then on the right side of the slide here, you see, again, two very famous folks, and we're very, very privileged to have them with us today. First, John Shook. John Shook's the chairman of the Lean Enterprise Institute. I was reading a little bit about John, and I was interested to learn that he actually worked for Toyota for 11 years. And I think that was probably the beginning of his journey into the lean world. He's written several books and numerous articles, been very influential in the field. In particular, there's a workbook called Learning to See that's all about value stream mapping. That one has been particularly impactful for me, and I've used it a lot with students, and I encourage you to look at that. Take a look at that if you're interested. Also interesting about John, he has a master's degree in industrial anthropology, which I think brings a unique perspective to the way he looks at things. And then, of course, Dr. James Womack. Jim is the founder of the Lean Institute, Lean Enterprise Institute. He, of course, co-authored The Machine That Changed the World, the book that probably truly did change the world in terms of launching this whole world of lean. Lean thinking is another great contribution that he made. Definitely has impacted my way of looking at production in general and Toyota Production Systems and lean and all these different pieces. And he's written many influential books. Also, interestingly, Jim has a background you might not expect in terms of educational. His PhD is in political science from MIT, and his dissertation was on comparative industrial policies, which I think launched him into this whole discovery and study of lean, comparing Japan and Germany and the US and the different ways they do things. So very distinguished panel, very excited to have everyone here. Let's go ahead and get into the discussion. And I want to start by asking each of our panelists, and Jim, if you wouldn't mind, I'd love for you to start us off. Just each of you, if you give us in 2 or 3 minutes, as briefly as you can, where are we with lean? What is the lean state of the art? And what do you think some of the important next steps for the advancement of lean would be?
Well, thank you. And thank you, Morgan, that you introduced me as Jim Womack, which is what they say down in Arkansas and Texas. After I moved to Boston 46 years ago, I changed my name to Womack because up here they couldn't spell that without a lot of L's. So it was a blast from the past there to hear myself by my original birth pronunciation. Made me feel right at home. So delighted to be here. Here is Boston, looking out on the Charles River, right across at MIT through my living room window. And I've been here, as I say, 46 years. About lean, I think I'm the root cause of quite a lot of confusion about lean through my inability to explain what I mean or what I meant. Way back when, in 1979, MIT decided to start studying the motor vehicle system. That was initially just to talk about how to make it lean and green. Oh, not lean, we didn't have the term lean, just make it green. And as that project got going, we got into some industrial dynamics, unavoidably, because the Japanese were disrupting the European and American players in the car industry, and we thought we should understand that. So we got all the way from 1979 to 1987 before we found the need to name what we were studying. And that happened. Some of you may know the story, but it has some historical interest. We were publishing an article in the Sloan Journal of Management at the Sloan School, and it was called The Triumph of the Blank Production System. And the blank was on our screen as we were trying to figure out what to call this. And we had a deadline. We had to have a name. When that comes up, what you do is go to the team room, get a whiteboard, and say, no one's leaving until we come up with a name. Got it, guys? And people had all kinds of names. We'll call it Japanism or Toyota for the companyism or Toyota D for the family, all of which seemed wrong. And so I had the idea, why don't we name it for what it does? And so we wrote on the blackboard, less effort, both to design things and to make things, less lead time, both in the fulfillment process, but also in the development process. Fewer mistakes and errors, less rework. Less inventory, less plant space, less CapEx, less. And so at that point, young John Krafchick, who was our kind of chief assistant, said, let's call it Lean. So I remember writing on that whiteboard, L-E-A-N, and I drew a circle or a rectangle or something around it and said, okay, what do you think? Can we leave now? And the team thought we can leave now. So that's how we got to Lean. But wait a minute, the original article, The Triumph of the Lean Production System, was, it turned out, a tremendous problem. That in the work we were doing and in the book we produced in 1990, we gave absolutely equal attention to the product development system, the fulfillment system from order to delivery, the supplier management, alignment improvement system, the customer support system, and the general management system. If anyone goes back to read that book, you will discover, as I have long known, that the exact same number of words devoted to each piece of the puzzle. And yet we used the term production. And we did that because we were contrasting this with mass production, which was a well-known term, which was not just, we thought, in people's minds about the factory, but was about the whole business system that General Motors had developed and which Sloan wrote the book about. So we were contrasting off of the General Motors system with the Toyota system. So hence we use the term production. That has led to, I think, much confusion, and I regret it. However, going back, I don't know what else we could have done. So it's not surprising if we start off with probably the wrong term, a fair amount of confusion ensues. And one additional dimension, and then I'll stop, that we thought of the Toyota production system as the process analysis piece of this puzzle. And we thought any value creation is the result of a process, of a series of steps that need to be done the right way, the right time, with the least waste, the least errors, in order to get a good result for the customer. So that therefore, in logic, a TPS could be applied to product development. It could be applied to supplier development, if you will, supplier improvement, could be applied to customer support. So that was the cross-cutting. That was the sort of horizontal. And then the vertical were what are normally functions, are silos in big companies of the product development group, the production group, the purchasing group, the marketing and sales group, and so forth. So we did our best to make that clear. I think it still is not clear. I wish it were. And so it's not surprising that as we have progressed, there is a fair bit of noise in relation to signal. And indeed, the ratio of noise to signal may be increasing. Now, of course, that's why POMS exist with the OpEx College, to get back to mostly signal and less noise. And that, by the way, is hard work. That's our rework. And of course, we know that rework is waste, but some rework is necessary to avoid the complete collapse of civilization. In this case, people just saying to heck with this lean stuff. So that's it. That's my view.
Thank you so much, Jim. That was very useful. And one of my best friends is growing up was named Womack. Down here in Texas, that's how we say it. So I apologize for not saying it correctly.
Yeah, that could have been Dooley Womack, who pitched one inning for the Yankees. He's the only family member who ever did anything athletic. Anyway.
Yeah. John, would you like to share? What do you think in terms of where we are with lean?
Okay, so I get to go next. Often puts me in a position of trying to correct what Dr. Womack had to say. I'll resist that temptation. I think the word is interesting, right? It does inform the conversation, and I think we can't avoid it. Thanks for the introduction. I did work for Toyota. I worked for Toyota in Japan when the book came out, the book, The Machine That Changed the World. And it was a big impact over there, actually, for the team there, the management team, the Toyota family, to see that someone was paying attention and recognize what they had been developing. And what they had been developing was something that was very dynamic. It had a set of principles underlying it, I think, and a lot of practices that can be seen. And they were very gratified, I think, when the book came out. You know, and I do think that, again, the term lean, if I were sitting in that room with Dr. Womack and the research team in 1988 or 87, whenever that was, I probably would have argued for another term. Lean, to me, I believe lean encompasses it's a holistic way of thinking about getting things done, how we organize ourselves, how we do work on behalf of customers, how we have a strategy, the very fabric of what our enterprise is. It's all there. And probably the English term lean does not contain all that nuance. And in fact, the term lean probably lends itself to thinking about efficiency, less rather than more, things like that. So even the recent paper, I think it was by Hopp and Spearman, as they introduced 4 lenses to think about what lean is or what lean research could be, they do. I think they make a statement that their beginning point is that lean somehow or another relates to efficiency. And I think if you accept that, then that takes you down a certain path. But I think that is a wrong path. And I think Jim was right that contributes to a lot of the noise that we hear. I think lean is something that there's an academic view of it. There's a practitioner world where people live in it. In addition to the word lean, it was originally lean production, then lean enterprise, then lean thinking, which I think is closer, but there are also associated practices and systems that go with it as well. And I think as we think about what it is today, how we think of it and how we should research it, it would be in a very holistic way. Just one more thing, and then I'll stop. But I see a lot of things out in the practitioner world, or we're probably talking with researchers as well, that excellent examples of what I would call lean thinking or lean doing, where the word lean is nowhere in sight. I see the opposite, which is a lot of companies, and maybe especially consulting companies selling things that are under the label of lean, which are the opposite of what I would call lean. So there, at the very least, there's confusion around the term. And then there's the need to unpack what the essence of it is so that we can all understand it better, and enterprises, organizations can use it to make things better.
Thanks, John. So Tyson, I see you shaking your head a lot there. Would you like to go next?
Sure, happy to go. I just want to thank this group for organizing this panel. I'm delighted to see it happening, delighted to be part of it, and excited to be talking about lean and to be here with my fellow panelists who certainly have amazing perspective on where we've come from and what was intended. And I agree that unpacking things is the right approach to make progress. And for that reason, my co-EIC at JOM, Suzanne DeTravelle, and I thought that we would stir the pot and provoke discussion by first, we talked with Wally Hopp and Spearman about producing a perspective on lean, which they graciously did. We then asked 8 commentators, including my 4 fellow panelists here, to offer perspective as well, which we were grateful for. If you haven't read those 2 pieces in JOM's forum, I invite you to do that because you'll get some very interesting insights about lean, and also become up to speed on some of these challenging points, like what is lean about, what does lean mean, and ultimately, I'm wanting to kind of take a dispassionate, neutral perspective of someone who wants to see the field advance, wants to see a holistic approach to operational excellence, not any more overly narrow approach. And so for that reason, some of the confusion that was just mentioned, and yeah, maybe some of it could have been avoided in hindsight. Maybe some of it's non-value adding rework, but I do think it is value adding at this point for us to clarify things, especially from the academic side. We have to nail down clear concepts and terminology and operationalizations if we want to compare things and so on. So I've got kind of a long version and a short version of an intro here. The long version is super long, maybe a few minutes, but I'll go ahead and give you the punchline, which Suzanne and I had put in an editorial following those two forum pieces, which we think that the term lean has, like Jim and John had mentioned, probably contributed some unnecessary confusion, and that we should, like they also said, be looking for a holistic approach to good operations management or operations excellence, however we want to think of it, and that lean is a key part of that, even with the narrow connotation and denotation of that term. There's certainly many places in operations management where less of something is the right amount, and where we should be looking to get leaner, be more efficient, get by with less. But as Jim and John also said, that's not always the point of operational excellence. So with that, I hope this debate continues and allows us to make some progress. I'll make two key points here that I think this idea of lean evolving has come up, that I think our understanding of lean as it began in the late 70s, early 80s, got a name in the late 80s, as kind of an attempt to describe the Toyota production system, or maybe just a couple of its key characteristics. Since that time, Toyota has evolved. Our understanding as academics of lean has evolved. Various other companies, of course, have successfully applied lean in their own contexts and evolved. And so it's like there was a big bang of kind of nailing down what lean was, but the galaxies have been moving in some different directions since that point. And I think since then, with that evolution, what many call lean has evolved in a broadening sense to encompass practices from TQM, reengineering, Six Sigma, and elsewhere. To many, lean is just synonymous with any process improvement or operational excellence. But I think that's a mistake to do that or assume that. I think for practitioners, it's confusing, as has come up already, just because of the simple connotation and denotation of the term lean, meaning less in most cases. We all know as academics that the optimum is not always the minimum. And so the term lean is not ideal or optimum for all operational excellence, especially these days. Natural disasters, trade wars, pandemic, supply chain hangups, material shortages, they've exposed a lot of challenges with minimum cost and inventory strategies. And it's hard to explain to students when I'm teaching, it's hard to explain to practitioners in consulting or in research that the path to getting leaner, if we take a holistic view, is to add back in just in case activities and inventories that had previously been deemed non-value added, even if that was a mistake and a misunderstanding, to go too far with that. So one reason I think it's a challenge is because practitioners struggle just with the term itself. But as Jim and John have said, that could be separated here. Second, I think even academics have been confused because we don't have a common definition of the phenomenon or concept of lean. And if it keeps changing, that is an additional complication there. And so basically, my argument is that lean does not equal operational excellence in every situation, but it could in some situations. Lean is narrowly defined as efficiency and so on. Of course, if we take a holistic view to operational excellence, as I think we all want to do, that's more than efficiency, then I just don't think lean is the right term for it. I think we have operational excellence as the right term for it. So I'll stop there and taken more than 3 minutes. So thank you.
Well, that you've kind of what is the word? Taking the first shot across the bow or something. So I love that. Thank you, Tyson, for that. And I think we all want to respond.
Always want to stir the pot.
Yeah, exactly. Great. But before we respond, Tor, I want to give Tor and Rachna a chance to kind of offer their opening salvos. That's what I was looking for. So Tor, what would you like to share with us?
Well, thank you. First of all, it's an honor to be on this panel with these illuminaries on lean, which I've studied and read so much about. My entry to lean was, of course, by nature a little bit later, around the year 2000s, and I worked with companies, and I saw how they struggled or they worked on implementing lean. I observed, though, that they didn't call it lean very often. Sometimes they called it their own company-specific production system, their name and the company-specific production system. And this is basically what I studied during my doctoral studies. And I figured these systems are not exactly the same. They are close to the Toyota production system, but they differ. And that is an important observation. What does that mean? It means that lean differs for different contexts. It means lean has evolved. In 1988, as Jim just said, or 1990, when they published the machine that changed the world, lean was equal to TPS. But from the second after that, it evolved. Even TPS evolved. TPS always evolves. So my point is that lean is evolving. So how can we then study it in an academic world? How can we pin it down? Maybe one way to do it is to look at lean from the inside and lean from the outside. If we look at the lean from the inside, we can break it down to practices, principles, philosophies, but in very specific contexts. So what is lean production? It's not the same as lean healthcare, but both of them use the term lean. If you look at it from the outside, I tend to like to look at it as a phenomenon, a business phenomenon. And then we can start to understand how lean is spreading across different industries, how it's varying, and so. I don't think it means that we cannot study it, because in each and every single piece of study, we can pin down what exactly we mean with lean. And if that is 80% the same as in another study, there should be opportunities to learn across these studies. Yeah, I think maybe that's some of my key points. We need to understand lean as a phenomenon. If we look at it from the outside, doesn't mean it cannot be operationalized, because it can if we look at it from the inside, principles, practices, philosophies, and it evolves. The way to study it, by the way, is on the Gemba. Just as when Jim and his colleagues around the world were studying the Toyota production system, you need to go to the companies who are struggling and trying to implement lean and trying to figure out what it means for them. I think that's the way forward for research on it as well. Yeah, I guess that summarizes it pretty well. I want to just end with I think Jim is kind of is asking if lean was the right word. Did we pick the wrong word? I think you picked the right word, Jim, because I don't think we would sit there if you call it fragile or whatever, or fitness, or it's something about the word which is lean in itself, right? It falls easily off the mouth. It's easy for all kind of other disciplines to take. There's some mystery around it, and that's what you need for a concept or phenomenon to catch on. So it's just a name. Fine. We need to look inside the box in different contexts to understand what that means.
Great. Thank you, Tor. Rashna, bring us
All
home.
right, so you leave me for the last, so I have to reconcile some of these concepts and points that we've already made. Actually, I would agree in some parts with each of the speakers. So I think we need very strong or very concrete definitions and understanding so we can operationalize it well. Without that, the theory and the field does not advance. So that is definitely a necessity. But what do you do when the observed phenomenon, I shouldn't say the understanding of the observed phenomenon has evolved over time? So in that aspect, I would agree with John and Jim's view. Our understanding of lean evolved piecemeal. So that means the holistic nature was never understood. So when Jim says, well, it is less effort, less lead time, less. If we think about it from a theory perspective, from the holistic perspective, there are many aspects of lean. If you go back to Toyota Production System or the machine that changed the world, there are many different sections or aspects of the business that lean can be applied. So I go back to, but when we think about, is it less effort or is it less lead time or is it less of material use? Lean is not any one of these things. Lean is all of these things. So then how do we reconcile and move forward? Well, I'll go back to my idea that I had proposed as a socio-technical system and lean as a strategy. So what does that mean? Well, if lean is holistically all of these objectives, all of these things that can be done, then different companies choose to emphasize different aspects of it depending on the needs of the organization at the moment in time that they are thinking about lean. So a company that is struggling with the cost aspect of it, it might focus on the waste aspect of lean. Whereas a company that is struggling with the lead time aspect, that might focus on the lead time. And perhaps the company is only looking at internal operations or their manufacturing operations. So they focus, that would be the boundary of implementation. But a company that is struggling with the supplier aspect in terms of incoming quality, that might deal with it a little differently. So what does that mean then? So if lean is a socio-technical system that needs to be aligned with the strategic needs of the company at that time, that means we need the social or the people aspect. We need the technical or the tools and practices aspect. And we need to have an understanding of what is the goal that we are trying to achieve in that particular problem. So lean as a strategy makes sense to me in that context. And then I would also say one more thing. From organizational theory, we realize no one strategy fits every context. And here we've been trying to kind of expect lean to fit and fix every problem. That is not how it goes. If it is context dependent, then it cannot, for example, if my waste elimination is the strategy of taking time out or taking waste out, it would not fit a shocking shock to the system such as a COVID. So we need to kind of have a better understanding of how lean as a strategy fits the context in which it is being applied to, with the understanding that it is a holistic view, but not all aspects of that holistic view might be applicable in every instance. So with that, I'll stop and see if that makes sense and if there are any other questions.
So before we move on, let me just say two things that seem to have popped out from the initial comments that you all offered were this idea of consistency and do we need consistency and what would that look like? And then the other one is context, right? Context seems to matter as we would expect that it would. And so how do we better address that? But before we move into a discussion of those two ideas, let me give everyone a chance. Does anyone want to respond to something that someone else said there? Yeah, go ahead, John.
Sorry. the student who raised his hand right away. A couple of things I would like to add, if it's okay. One is, so I agree with Tor's observation about the word lean. So I want to correct what I was saying earlier. If I had been there in 1988 or whenever, I would have probably argued for a different term. Having said that, I agree with Tor, it doesn't really matter. Even though I think the word lean may have caused some confusion, but any term was going to cause confusion. There was going to be a need to further define it over time anyway. For example, Tyson mentioned we have other terms. So if lean is not whatever, efficiency and the things we've said, we have other terms for those things, such as operational excellence. I would say operational excellence doesn't actually hit it at all. I would reference what Raghunath said, which is very holistic. So it's not something that can actually reside just in, as far as the academic view, it can't exist only in the operations management departments. It's not only a business school thing. And this is something universities are horrible at, which is actually connecting silos across the universities. There's no type of organization in the world that's worse at that than universities. The whole point of lean is that it's something that meets the real world, and then you deal with it holistically. Right. And that's going to mean it's the natural homes are probably Department of Operations Management and over in engineering, industrial engineering. But actually, we need the organizational development department. We need the philosophy department. We need it truly is a holistic approach. And I think Raghunath was absolutely right that it is a strategy. It is social technical. Can never forget that. And I think often we, especially earlier days, probably paid less attention to the social side. And that was probably a correction, I think, that is happening now, but it absolutely is contextual. However, I would add a little, I think, however, it is more lasting. So as we were, the audience might know, as we had a preliminary discussion amongst us about a month ago, we kind of more or less were agreeing that it's evolving. And I think that came out in this conversation. However, what I would say is from the very beginning, going back to my experience with Toyota in Japan, it was always something that there were some essential principles, some essential thinking. And then there were constantly, rapidly, radically evolving practices, depending on the words that I use, Raghunath, as you mentioned, it's a strategy. What I was always asked when I was at Toyota is whenever I would propose something or work on something, what problem are you trying to solve? And depending on that, you would then tap into this essential thinking and some practices that have been developed over years, and you would apply those. So I don't know that the essential thinking has actually changed so much, and maybe even not at all. I mean, are there other customers? Do they have needed value? Is there some waste or problems to be solved? And then are there gaps between the way we are today and our aspirations, or as Raghunath said, our objectives as a company? Yes, always. Those don't go away. So that's always a starting point. And then there's more specific thinking that we can apply to that and practices that have evolved over the years. So the practices have evolved greatly. They will, and more than they have evolved over time, they evolve by the situation. And just one more thing, and I'll try to stop. Even this ongoing, were we talking about TPS or not? Well, the original articulation of TPS was production system in the factory, mainly. That's not what Jim and the team did when they wrote Machine. They were talking about factory, sales and marketing. They were talking about product development. They were talking about supply chain management and in particular, then an overall management system. It was always more than that. And that's why even if you went inside Toyota 30 years ago or today, it looks very different in product development than it looks on the factory floor. Very, very different. So that context in itself has always been different. And so it makes perfect sense then as you go into healthcare, what people call lean healthcare does look very different than what people call lean construction. It does, and it should, and there's nothing inconsistent with that. And what I would think of as lean thinking applied to enterprises. I shall stop there. Thank you.
Other thoughts before we move ahead? Go ahead.
No, Jim, you go.
Well, let me just add one more dimension to the lean thing. That the moment at MIT we got through with the whiteboard, instead let's call it lean, that started an enormous argument between the technically focused people, the kind of engineer types who love this idea of horizontal process analysis, and the fragile people. And the fragile people said, look, it's all about the social context. This is a socio-technical issue, and calling it lean makes it a technical issue. Big mistake. you should call it fragile. And that was John Paul McDuffie, long now at Wharton in the business school there, and Haruo Shimada, who was a professor at Keio University in Tokyo. And they were terribly upset. This was a tremendous sort of shouting match there outside of the room where we figured out lean, that we were just looking in the wrong end of the telescope. That the point of lean was that it was a learning organization. It was about developing people. It was about engagement. And so there was a second problem there that we had with us right from the beginning. And I think that has continued to be, in some cases, true. By the way, I was the decider, so let's finger me as the heavy. I said I can't imagine convincing certainly an American and probably a European CEO to embrace fragile production. I can't imagine how you would write the shareholder letter that explains that we've gone from Taylor and mass production to fragile production in our company. You're going to love it. It's the right thing to do. So I must say I was just being instrumental and maybe expedient, but in the interest of what I thought was a larger cause. And so that continues to be both a confusion and I think a very fertile thing to research. Start from the human perspective rather than the technical perspective and see what you see.
Marketing matters, definitely. Rashna.
Yeah, I want to say one more thing. So in terms of the business phenomenon, I think it is a business phenomenon. I also think that there is the underlying thinking or principles that tie to it. But if we make it truly to be a business phenomenon that is very unique to each company, then we cannot make advancement in theory. So then it becomes a company-specific phenomenon that we are studying. My argument here is that there are basic principles that underlie the business phenomenon, but the way each company enacts it is different depending on the needs of the company. So if we do carry on with the idea of if I want to make improvements, I need tools and practices. That brings the technical aspect. I cannot do it without people involvement. That brings the social system. And I cannot do it without aligning it to the strategic focus of the company. That brings the business phenomenon aspect of it. All three need to be, socio and technical systems are needed to enact the strategy that is required at hand. And that that aligns it well with the business phenomenon perspective. It does not solve the problem that Tyson has raised. How do we reconcile these issues for the advancement of our field? Now, that requires a little more thinking. Maybe we cannot resolve it today, but in my mind, the fact that we have evolved is an evolution of our understanding, not the necessarily the evolution of the basic principles that underlie that thinking. So I'll give you one example, right? I mean, if you think about long time ago, we thought Earth was the center of the solar system. And then we got more knowledge and we realized, no, sun is the center of our solar system. And then we realized not really. Our solar system just belongs to this galaxy and there is some center and we all revolve around it. And now we know that there are multiple millions of galaxies that revolve around something. So I think the fact that understanding is evolving does not change should not change the basic principles underlying it. It is a matter of discovering and applying it over time. And I'll stop with that.
Maybe this would be an opportune time just to show some of the results from the poll, because I do think they echo some of the things we've talked about here very briefly. So we asked the audience 3 questions. First, is lean mainly about efficiency or more than efficient? Oh, sorry. First question was, is lean a solidified concept that was well established in the 90s or continuously evolving? And you could see the majority, 85% of the folks do I was about to say agree. I'm not sure if they agree with all of us, but the folks who have spoken, many of you have mentioned this evolution or potential for growth and change. Most folks agree with that. The second poll question was, is lean mainly about efficiency or more than efficiency? Pretty strong majority here, 95% say no, it's more than just efficiency. And then the third question was, is lean a factory concept applicable to manufacturing or broadly applicable beyond manufacturing? And an even stronger majority, 97% say it's broadly applicable there. So the audience seems to feel pretty strongly that lean has grown, has evolved, both in terms of concept and also context where it can be applied. So if we go back to these ideas of concept or content, the consistency of it, and how do we deal with this trade-off between the real recognition that lean is enacted? I think that word was used earlier in different ways in different company settings, but we need some kind of consistency in definition in order to be able to study it. What suggestions do you have to help us deal with that trade-off?
I'll give it a try, Morgan. Again, I'd like to think about it as a phenomenon that you can break down from the outside. Maybe lean is evolving and all of these things, but when you look inside and we look at how these things are enacted in factory floors, you can study them, you can describe them as practices, as principles, and you can write about them. Now, whether or not that description is valid for another company in another context, there you need to do a translation. We always need to do that translation. But of course, if we take lean production, it's very, very well studied. We have a good understanding of what lean production means. It doesn't mean that companies are able to do it, but I think we know what it is. And we can learn a lot from Toyota, of course, still. A few years ago, I did a little bit of an exercise together with a friend of mine, Daryl Powell. And we wrote a book called The Routledge Companion to Lean Management, in which we invited 73 lean authors, some of them are involved here today, to think about lean applied to different contexts. So we had lean police, lean military, lean government, we had lean in the office, lean whatever, 40 chapters. And then we tried to say, okay, now we read all of these chapters and what's common? Because Rachna is talking about what are the common principles. If we do this in lean production, I think we can draw out some principles that are actually close to her articles, called the bundle of practices of lean, just in time, TQM, TPM, HRM practices, all of those. But if you look at lean across the board, then we actually found there were only 3 commonalities used in all these studies across lean disciplines, and that was a long-term perspective for some reason. So short-termism has no role in lean. The second one was leadership, and leadership behaviors are of course also very, very important. So all the behavioral aspects that are in lean, we just need to focus more on. The third one, and I think the most central one to lean, is learning. We summarize it with 3 L's just to come up with 3 things that start with the same letter. But these 3 things summarize the concept. And lean is the continuous improvement, is the continuous improvement story, Kaizen. Everywhere where lean is applied, Kaizen is key. So I don't know if this is adding to so at the phenomenon level, these 3 L's is the only principles that are common. So we need to break it down, I guess, to application areas in order to be able to describe these things, to move it forward research-wise.
Dyson, yes.
Just a quick clarification, and hopefully our College of Operational Excellence here would agree that when we say operational excellence, we're not only talking about production. The term has already been said here several times, lean production, as if lean is assumed to be shorthand for that. But I don't think it always is. I think a lot of people think of lean in other ways besides production, which is terrific. I also think I completely agree that lean is multifunctional, multidisciplinary, holistic, not factory or production or even the so-called operations department or function. Last year in JOM, I wrote an editorial called Operations Management Writ Large, which was an attempt to define operations in a much more holistic way, and their improvement or their excellence would similarly be viewed holistically, not merely as the job of one piece of the organization, but as all the work done in the organization. And so from that point of view, I do maintain operational excellence would be our goal, because that's the excellence of the entire organization, the entire corporation, the entire entity, enterprise, however you want to term that. And then I would also argue that we're looking to improve its value, not from just a customer perspective. We're looking to improve it from the perspective of all of its stakeholders. And that includes employees. And Lean has in the past talked about respect for employees, and that social aspect has been critical. It also includes the managers, it includes the shareholders who want a return on their investment. It also includes society, communities, suppliers. And so there is an ecosystem that if we just maximize value to customers, we can get thrown off because we can miss some of these other stakeholders. If we just look at the workers, we can also miss, we have to balance all of these. And I think that's what we really mean when we say operational excellence. But it's important, I think, not to get, to lose sight of that. And I think most of where our so-called debate, if there is any here, boils down to is semantics in a lot of cases, because I do think we pretty much agree on what our objectives are.
Go ahead, John.
Okay, thank you. And in fact, Tyson, that was kind of my point in mentioning that I'm actually okay with the term lean, just because no matter what term is chosen, we're going to have to define it, or we're going to have to talk about it. And so operational excellence, I think, also has its nuances that you can describe as you did in your paper, operational excellence writ large, or operations management writ large. So I think it needs to include, not everything you said. I think you really stated it well. I agree 100%. And I think as long as, even when we said operational excellence, that includes strategy. So if when you say operations, it includes that. But again, then it starts, there's always this definitional thing. So you can call it semantics. And that's why above my head, you will see the old Magritte painting of the pipe, which is, there's the, I won't say this French, but I believe the French there says, this is not a pipe. And the meaning is that there's a painting of a pipe. And so I think the meaning to me of that is that words are always getting in the way. If you go back to the old Toyota stuff, Taiichi Ohno himself was tremendously suspicious of words. He did not, they had the same debate in Toyota 50 years ago. He didn't want them to name TPS. So when you name it, you're creating exactly what's happening now. So I think it's always going to happen. And I think it's just incumbent upon us then to continue to dive into it, continue to explore further and articulate further. That's all, as Ragnar said. That we understand more now, we're going to understand more as we unpack it, we'll understand more in the future. I am one of the, just briefly, in the introduction, Morgan, thank you. You mentioned my industrial anthropologist thing. So I kind of made that up. So I went to school and cobbled together a lot of different work in different departments to make that happen. And I think part of understanding the way the world is, there can be a certain comfort with ambiguity, but not just letting it stop and rest there. I think there's ambiguity around these terms, the semantics, any terms we use. So we want to dive in and understand them more deeply. I think as soon as we do, it's never going to just be hammered in stone. Now we're done. I can't tell you, just a quick final thing. How many times I've given someone a question that I intended as a question to just ponder forever, for the rest of your life. What's the role of HR in an enterprise? And then 2 years later, the person comes back and says, I figured it out. Here's my manuscript. And I said, no, that's not, it's always an evolving thing. It's going to fit, it needs to fit the strategy exactly like Ragnar said. I think that's a really important piece of what we're talking about here that we should try to not forget. Thank you. I'll stop there.
I'll say one other thing, because I think it is very important point that Tyson was raising. Earlier, I talked about the observed phenomenon, or our understanding of the observed phenomenon that evolved over time. It is also about the observer themselves, or maybe their background, or maybe the context with which we study it. So what do I mean by that? The academic challenge is to define the question so narrowly that it can be tested in a very meaningful way. But if that is the deal, we cannot always go to the holistic nature of Toyota, which is a very complex and very sort of confusing in some ways system. So if we are required to, the observer background or the observer narrowness of it also is another challenge that will contribute to it. So how can we make progress in it? Perhaps understand that if I am studying it in the healthcare context, what form would, I'm talking about the morphological or structural form, lean might take in that setting, and what is the problem that we are trying to solve in that setting? So I'll give you a very interesting example. You know, we are trying to apply lean in healthcare setting. There's code red and code blue. But how do we solve problems in a manufacturing setting? Well, I see a problem, I pull the end-on cord, the line stops. We cannot do that in a healthcare setting. However, we can, because we cannot just leave the patient to die, we have to be able to solve that problem. However, can we take a couple of minutes to understand what the problem was and communicate it to the right people? So we did a pilot test in very large healthcare system here in town, and we called it Code Lavender. Code Lavender is the idea that I see a problem. If I do not know the answer, can I call a specific person to resolve the problem? So think about real-time problem solving, the end-on cord idea with this Code Lavender. Now, is Code Lavender really very different? Not really, because I was thinking of end-on cord when I proposed the idea, but it looks different from the outsider view. But anyway, my point is that the academic challenge of testing things neatly makes us sort of carve it out into very narrow questions, narrow constructs, narrow operationalization. So we never get to that holistic level. I don't think we disagree at all on the holistic nature of it. I think we disagree on how do we test it and how do we present the evidence in an academic sense. I think there are very interesting questions online, Morgan, if you want to also.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If everyone's okay, then let's turn to this context issue. That's come up several times already, and it's a really exciting time to be thinking about lean in different contexts. And there, I want to offer 3 quick examples. So, of course, with the disruption in COVID, a lot of writers have kind of challenged some of the lean approaches and maybe tried to identify weaknesses in lean as somehow contributing to the disruptions that we've seen. I had the opportunity to work a couple of years ago with Yong Yin and Kathy Steck and other researchers to look at how some companies in Japan have departed from traditional lean approaches to try to design more flexible and responsive structures, especially in terms of assembly cells called Siru, things like that. And then one of our audience members posed the question, in Silicon Valley, lean has a bad reputation. It's perceived as too slow, too incremental, too outdated, to digital processes in Industry 4.0. Any thoughts on how to overcome that? So we have these different challenges that are emerging from different environmental changes. What do we do? How do we deal with lean in that? How can researchers learn from these circumstances? Where should we go forward?
My quick response, if I could, just to the 2 examples you mentioned. So there's some abandonment of lean in Japan, someone mentioned, and then also that in Silicon Valley, it might be considered too slow and outdated. I think it gets back to everything we've been talking about a deeper and more accurate or better understanding of what we mean by lean. It's when we used to try to describe it again, when I was at Toyota 30, 35 years ago, we would often say, before the word lean was around, we would say, maybe we should, instead of Toyota production system, we should say flexible production system. So the idea that by shortening the lead time and by having great quality here and now, you can actually be extraordinarily flexible, that is built in. So I do think also in terms of terms, not to get sidetracked, but agile was probably a pretty good term. And of course, Agile came about originally before the software guys took it over with the Agile Manifesto. It was an American response, an academic response to what the challenge that was coming from Japan. So instead of lean, we're going to be agile here, and that's a fine word, but it does. So I think an ultimate lean organization would be highly adaptive to things that are coming at you in order to meet your, to Ragnar's point again, your strategy or your purpose. Like it always starts with purpose, the job to be done, the problem to be solved. And then from there, you back up to certain principles that can be applied and practices that can be brought to bear. So thank you.
Tyson?
I have something I share with my students, which is kind of a boom bust theory of process improvement, where any particular approach to process improvement tends to highlight, focus on a particular aspect of it, give it a name, whether that's Six Sigma, Lean, any other, TQM, where of course what we really want is good management. If we really back up and think generally, we want to get the most productive, be most effective, add the most value. I mean, these are our fundamental foundational objectives. And yet some particular avenue towards that emphasizes something, or in people's minds, emphasizes something, whether it's less of something or more of something. And we give it a name and people start applying it, or a company is very successful applying it. And then there's a lot of people who say, wow, okay, I want to be better, so I'm going to do that too. And they are also successful in many cases, but there are also a lot of people who don't really understand what they're doing and try to emulate and are unsuccessful. And over time, unfortunately, the people who misapply, misunderstand, start to outnumber the people who did it correctly. And this can give that buzzword, whatever it is, a negative connotation in any context, Silicon Valley or elsewhere. And so for that reason, we're finding we have to constantly reinvent and repackage. The underlying practices are, of course, powerful, useful, and are never going to go away. But often the way we have to advertise them to the CEO or the shareholders in the letter has to be marketed differently. And so we've got that socio-technical aspect to deal with as well. The simple fact that if we want to improve operations or enterprises, we have to marshal resources to do that. We can't just have good practices and methods in our toolkit. And so these are challenges as well. And this boom bust theory says, okay, we have to put this away. I mean, there's an old Dilbert cartoon where Dogbert, the consultant, comes into the manager and says, you have to implement Six Sigma or you're doomed. And the manager says, this is just TQM stuff. And Dogbert says, yes, but I assure you it has a totally, totally different name. And so I think part of the semantics challenge is not just what we call it as academics, but how we sell it and market it, where companies do need improvement and can benefit from our practices.
So I feel like we need to address this. We've got several questions that are in this kind of realm of context regarding COVID. And there has been a lot of press around that. So I'd love to give the panelists a chance to address that. What's your thought on lean in the time of COVID, and how would you respond to some of the critiques that have been out there? Yes.
Can I just say a couple of things? Again, let's go back to a little bit of history, that the sort of formalized TPS was done for a production system that was in one city, Toyota City, in which all of the players were equity interlocked. So therefore, the Toyota Group was the 300 companies that cross-held a majority of the equity, so that the idea of creating a basic stability was actually plausible, that the whole system was under a group management, but it was under management. And so therefore, when you talked about dealing with disruptions, the disruptions were at the level of a factory. The Ashland factory catches fire. The disruptions were at a level of one of the members gets into big financial trouble and needs some backstopping. But there was not a lot of attention to what to do from a production control standpoint in the event of something that is completely off the scale. And so therefore, the theory was that as the upstream processes become more stable and robust, and as downstream demand is leveled by Heijunka, you can carry less and less inventory, because that in fact was the purpose of what you were doing, was to do small amounts frequently, flexibly, so you can respond to small shifts, abrupt small shifts, but in fact there aren't any big shifts. So then we get to a world where you've got tsunamis, and not that they're strangers to tsunamis in Japan, but it just never happened to the extent that it did 10 years ago. That we've had economic tsunamis, if you will. And by the way you deal with that is by holding a big cash reserve, which Toyota has always done. They would say, this is our financial Heijunka. It permits us to go through the ups and downs of a market economy without having to lay people off or to delay programs, okay? And so actually the kind of classic JIT works fine in a situation that is not totally disruptive. But they had an answer to disruption, which was, well, you need emergency stock, which are outside of the normal JIT framework. And these are based on your crystal ball, on some calculation of what the risk is of a disruption. And of course, the problem with disruption is that prediction is in general impossible. So therefore, you're going to have a 2-year pandemic out there in the future. Just how much should you lay aside to deal with the 2-year pandemic? How about 2 years of reserves of every part? How about 2 years of factory extra capacity so that when the tsunami takes it out, you're good to go? So there is, I think, just in the nature of things, a limit on how much you can do to manage your circumstances. And yet the expectation that was created out of all of the just-in-time JIT work was that it was always able to respond. This is not true. No one in Toyota thought that was true. And yet the world looked at the current situation and said, well, if this JIT stuff was any good, well, goodness, we would just be able to run this thing very smoothly. So that's just a problem. It is a problem for all of us to try to resolve through some more effective explanation than apparently we have been able to offer. But also there's a certain realism there, that beyond a given level of disruption, there is no production system that can continue to operate in a sort of smooth, effective way that is responsive to the customer. Now, I've just said what the problem is. I haven't given you the answer, but it is, I think, unfortunate that we get dinged. Oh, and just one final thing about JIT. The media has gotten off it just a little bit, but article after article about the problem here is JIT in a world where, in fact, hardly anybody actually practices what Toyota would call JIT. It is still an MRP inside ERP world, okay? So therefore, we're being blamed for practices that don't exist and which are not designed and do not claim to be designed to have crystal ball foresight into major disruptions. So that's the mess that we find ourselves in, trying to, I think, protect ourselves from some unfair criticism, but also to be realistic and frank.
Thank you. That's a great summary and response, I think. So let's focus on the future. That's the title of this session. I think we've, as a panel, you have laid out some of the key issues and given us some great perspective, historical, as well as other kinds of perspective. Where should we go? Given the opportunities today, the applications that are there, the success stories as well as the failure stories. One of the comments was, why does it fail so often? I'm not sure where that's coming from, but there are certain implementations that don't yield. You know, what can we do to learn from these things? Where should we go? What questions should we be asking?
Can I take a first stab, and then perhaps the others will have. So if we go back to the basic principles of how Lean or Toyota Production System, when did it flourish or how did it flourish? The idea is that the supply chains were not geographically as dispersed as they are today. So the supply chains were more localized, which meant that the chances or probability of disruptions were also localized, which could be dealt with in a just-in-time systems. Now, if we are applying this phenomenon, we are applying the Lean principles to these geographically distributed supply chains, where the lead times are 6 months to 18 months to 2 years in some supply chains. You cannot possibly keep minimal amount of inventory if we are continuing with the idea of inventory. So going back to the basic principles of, does the JIT system suit our current circumstances, or strategically looking at the need or fit of that for our current circumstances is a must in my mind. Is the first lesson that we should have learned a long time ago when tsunami came, but definitely in today's day and age of COVID, it becomes more real. That would be my first, where do we go from here?
Thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, I totally agree with the thing you're talking about, resilience, globalization. We need to figure out the Lean's role in this. And maybe all on the panel totally agree with Jim. This has been a huge misunderstandings and maybe unwarrantedly actually claimed as a Lean failure. If anybody on the call are interested in reading more of this, actually, I would recommend to check what Chris Tang and Manu Hamsoudi is writing about these things. I find that very enlightening as well. I want to add a couple of more things to resiliency. I think we need, as a Lean community, to figure out, again, maybe, Lean's role in resiliency. Right now, the UN Climate Change Conference is going on in Scotland. We've talked about Lean and Green for a while, but it becomes kind of a special community that's interested in these questions. Lean is the way forward for reducing the number of parts and maybe even just make a more sustainable consumption. I'm wearing this t-shirt today, responsible consumption and production, and that's where Lean can help as well. So we need to do more in the sustainability sphere. And third, I want to, of course, mention the digitization of manufacturing. Some see it as Lean is old hat, it's out. Now everything is Industry 4.0 digital technologies. That's just completely misunderstood the role of Lean actually going forward. I see the new technologies as an opportunity to realize, finally, maybe even help companies implement Lean. With digitization, you can get that supply chain transparency that you need in order to pull, not just from one process to another, but through the whole chain. And with technologies like AI, you can actually augment the workforce instead of automating them away from the jobs. You can help them do the jobs better. And we need to keep, of course, the Lean thinking, as I said, learning, leadership, long-term perspective. We need that stuff. And then when we add technology, we can do great things. So in these three things, I'd like to see more research: resiliency, sustainability, and Industry 4.0, if you'd like.
Other thoughts? Jim and John, what can we do as academics to help forward or Tyson?
So Jim and Tyson could speak more, you know, as the academics here, not me. So I'll just say a couple of words first, which I agree with everything that's being said, you know, Ragnar and Tor. I would just add that Just recalling some of the earlier discussion, seems to me what we need, maybe speaking a little bit on behalf of the practitioner community. I think the most useful research would be, first of all, cross-disciplinary. To Ragnar's point, well, we're good at really narrowing something down really, really tight, and that doesn't go away. That's okay. But also research that is highly cross-disciplinary, that looks at the real world. So the lean principle of Gemba or Genchi Genbutsu. So I guess in research that kind of translates into action research. Of course, case studies can be dismissed pretty easily because if it's just one anecdote, but something then, a multidisciplinary approach to research, both in the disciplines within academia, also partnership with practitioners, with industry, but also then approaches that are both, some could be quantitative, that's fine, but also some that really are more ethnographic in nature. And I think in the introduction that you did earlier, Morgan, you introduced the members of your the board. Right now, I think you're the chair of this, and one of the members is Gopesh Anand, and he and some colleagues did some research a couple of years ago using what they called a quasi-experimental approach that I thought was just really promising because it had almost the case study ethnographic piece, but also connected in a way you could look across an industry. So I think innovative research like that is really called for. So we can tell the story in a more holistic way. And as far as what to research, lean and green, sustainability, yes, of course. Those are the things to research. But then how to research them in a way that will also bring enlightenment on what we mean by lean, I think is also something that's needed. Thank you.
Well, let me give one more non-academic perspective, that when I look at the org chart of any university, it looks to me like the org chart of General Motors in the old days, that you've got functional silos, we all know that, that you say, well, who's looking horizontally? Everybody's looking vertically. And you know within your silo that you have to look up, you have to defend the cannon on the way up, prove you're a good troop, loyal to your silo, and it's just a fact. And then you look at, again, what our lean poster child, by the way, I think still is, Toyota, years ago, and created the idea called the chief engineer, which we misdescribed in Machine. By the way, we just got it totally wrong. By the way, I would say for the revised version of Machine, you will find something that you never find in academic literature or any literature, that there's a whole chapter in that book on what was wrong with the original version. And one of the things that was wrong was that we thought that the chief engineer, everybody reported to the chief engineer. There was this powerful person who could see end to end, and everyone was in lockstep because the chief engineer was cracking the whip. Turns out not so. So in the academic world, interesting that if the longer term purpose of academic enterprise is to actually come up with useful solutions to human problems, and at least useful perspective on human problems, it sort of follows that if you want to study something, you have to form up a team of all of the different functional perspectives to actually work together to say, what is the problem here? And what do each of us have to contribute? Now you say, oh, that's just completely impossible, ridiculous, and so forth. Well, okay, there are a lot of things about lean that were completely impossible, ridiculous, and so forth before Toyota. So just something to think about. It is, by the way, part of my objection to the operational term, that if you call it operational, the rest of the university world will think, aha, that's either you operations management people, or even worse, you operations research people, whatever you may claim. This is just one or two, depending on how you define it, silos that are doing turf war, and they're trying to take some of our turf. So how could we get beyond, on a research basis, what I would call single silo analysis, and instead say, why don't, doesn't any research project have to be a team activity? in which you have a number of perspectives. And then you start back from what is the issue that we're trying to understand. And we hope to do something useful for civilization in studying. How could we do that? And by the way, I've got no answer at all. But I do have the feeling that I've had for 40 years that there's some smart person out there in the academic world who would say, hey, it's time for lean academics, if you will, rather than mass production, modern management academics. And we all ought to rally around and do some experiments. So again, I feel kind of foolish proposing something that you will say is undoable, but sometimes it's useful to describe the need and then say, okay, if that's the need, well, then the people who are in the trenches figure out how to do it. And I'll look forward to reading all about it.
That's great. I completely agree that in the academic world, we're even worse than most enterprises in terms of integrating across our silos. And I completely agree that these questions require that. We're very bad at valuing interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary. We count things within our silos, and we're just as bad as industry people in that way, if not worse. So I agree that that's probably a more fundamental challenge to the future of all academic research and business schools, especially. As far as the specifics here with lean or operations or however we want to define improving our enterprises, I do think we need to go back to basics, but we need to go back even further than others have said. I think we need to go back to terms like value, productivity, efficiency, effectiveness, and talk about how we get more of whatever it is we want. And if we want to add things like resilience as explicit objectives or criteria, we should do so. And if we want to have sustainability and long-term thinking in there as well, so we're not optimizing or minimizing in the short term, but over a longer horizon, that's certainly appropriate. So I think part of our challenge, and Jim put it very well, let's frame the problem broadly and correctly first, and then hopefully the right people will line up and bring ideas about how to work together to solve it. But productivity, value, these are fundamental concepts in operations management or just good management that don't belong exclusively to lean or to any other strategy for operational excellence. Or I think lean can become an obstacle there, because if people go into it with that lens, or even one of 4 different lenses on it, those lenses could still be myopic to the broad holistic approach that we have all been talking about. And we can sit here and say that that shouldn't be correct, that's wrong, they shouldn't be myopic, they shouldn't focus on efficiency, they shouldn't focus on less. But the practical reality is that's what a lot of people do when they hear the term lean. And so I don't have the answer for how to differently market what we're doing to cut through the clutter of ideas in the world. But I will say that if we approach the problems broadly and fundamentally, we probably will need one, if not more, terms that get people's attention. And I think lean could be one of those terms. I don't think it's all bad or out of favor everywhere, by no means. I just think that it should be used in places where its connotation and denotation fit and are intuitive to recipients. And that when we study other operations or systems that emphasize other things, they should get different names. That we shouldn't try to label them all as this company's version of lean, just because that's the lens we're coming through. And so for academic research, I think it's important. Unfortunately, even semantics matter, definitions matter, operationalizations matter. And putting the term lean as a qualifier in front of production or anything else we're studying, I think can be an unnecessary qualifier in many cases. It's the right term for certain situations, but not as broadly as many academics have tended to use it. That's why we called our article a lean view of lean. Not that lean was inappropriate or needed to be replaced, but it needed to have a place in a broader pantheon of approaches and strategies to improving operations.
Here, I'd like to be a little bit provocative, or at least disagree a little bit with Tyson, because my experience is trying to publish my company-specific production system research back in the days it was hard. Journals like your own, Tyson, Journal of Operations Management, wasn't really interested in that type of, what's this, a new concept? Seriously, then this is TPS, lean, you can call. So I started to call it corporate lean programs, and suddenly your journal was receptive to my research. But that doesn't mean that it's not operationalized. So, for example, in my own research, it was operationalized in terms of what Volvo AB that I worked with did. And they had very specific principles and practices that made up their Volvo production system. So I used the term lean to get the attention, if you'd like, of practitioners and editors and reviewers, and then operationalize it with how it looks like on Gemba for Volvo.
So we're coming down to the end here. We've got about 3 minutes. I'd like to summarize a couple of things from the chat. The chat has been really fantastic. There's a lot of great ideas there. So in addition to what the panelists talked about, which is sustainability, both environmental and social, and lean's contributions to that, globalization, and how lean is changing in the face of more dispersed supply chains. Clearly technology, digital transformation, all of that, what are the implications for lean, and then the interdisciplinary, the need to do more interdisciplinary work. In addition to that, in the chat, we see suggestions for more innovative methods, including ethnographic types of methods, a more interpretivism or phenomenological approach. I think that's kind of what Tor was actually just referring to a little bit in terms of methods. At the larger view, we could look at the diffusion of lean. One of the commenters said, lean has moved from being kind of counterintuitive and the new thing to become the more conventional approach. How has that affected the diffusion of it? Has it accelerated? Has it decelerated in terms of adoptions? Another commenter suggested, well, we could study more about theory and practice. Does the practice actually align with theory, or is it against theory? What are the disconnects there? How can experiences in lean implementation inform behavioral theory? Respect for people was brought up earlier. That's an important part of the overall paradigm. What does it have to say for more largely general behavioral theories? And then lastly, and this is one of my favorites, of course, we've talked about academia and its siloed nature. So what would it look like to apply lean in an academic enterprise? Is it even possible? Will we ever have lean? We're actually under a lot of pressure right now. Of course, academia is. Maybe now's the time to try.
Less administration.
Yeah, well, yeah, of course. Well, that's what I'm talking about. We don't want to apply to ourselves, just administrators. So I want to take this, you're down to the end here. So thanks again so much to the panelists. We really appreciate your time sharing your thoughts with us and the history and the ideas. Also want to mention to those of you, thanks to those of you who are in the audience, I hope you appreciated this and learned something from it. I know I did. We're going to have another webinar in the January-February timeframe. So stay tuned for that. We haven't quite nailed down the topic yet. I think we could probably do a whole nother session that maybe addresses some of the questions that were raised in this webinar, but we'll see where that comes from. But keep your eyes open. Also, please consider submitting abstracts to the Operational Excellence track in the POMS meeting that will happen next April. We're planning a mini conference, face-to-face, probably a hybrid type of mini conference on the Thursday before the POMS conference. And we also have a best paper competition that is the finalists will be presenting at that mini conference. So consider submitting a paper to that competition. Entries are due by January 15th. Reach out to Matthias Thurrer at this email address. And you can probably also look on the POMS webpage. I don't think our information is there yet on the competition, but it will be very shortly. So with that, again, thank you to the panelists. You've done a wonderful job. Really appreciate it. Also want to say thank you to Sven Janosik and Juan Ryuho, the doctoral students who've been making the technology part of this work. Thanks, everybody, and we hope to see you again next time.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks,
Have a good
everyone.
weekend.